So that's control and governance. There's a second bucket, economics. So control is having a say. Governance is having visibility and input. Economics, cold hard cash, baby, which of course is the general reason and the prime motivator why an investor is buying preferred shares to begin with. We're going to get into some technical jargon, the kind of jargon that if you spend any time in the seed deal or the venture capital space, you're going to hear a lot. So bear with me, we're going to take it a piece at a time, and I think by the time we get to the end of it and we've unpacked it all, it'll make a lot of sense. But these concepts come up time and time again. So we're talking about preferred shares, and we're talking about the economics that apply to preferred shares. First concept is something called a liquidation preference. Now, the first thing I want to point you to is the first word, which is liquidation. Founders will typically ignore this portion of the term sheet or the investment documents because they see liquidation and they think to themselves, well, that's bankruptcy. That's a teenager standing on the corner, 90% off, going out of business, liquidation, everything must go. And there's some truth to that. That's liquidation. But that's not the only liquidation. There's another liquidation, which is, hey, we sold our assets for $1 billion. We paid off our liabilities, which are $100 million, which leaves $900 million for equity. The net proceeds, which are available for distribution to the stockholders, pursuant to the cap table. Well, how do we get this $900 million in net proceeds into the hands of the stockholders? How do we do it? We have to liquidate the company. That's a good liquidation, okay? You're in a situation where you're liquidating a corporation in order to crack out $900 million for distribution to the stockholders. That's a great thing. So what we're talking about here is a critical and transcendent concept, because if what these companies are really working for, besides innovation, besides scientific advancement, besides building a legacy and a culture, and these are all critical things that startups are about, but beyond that, they're also looking to cash a check, and this is when you're cashing it, in liquidation. So pay attention. Yes, there are bad liquidations, but there are also good liquidations, and this applies. Okay. With that as prelude, what's the preference? Well, the preference is always expressed as a multiple of the purchase price. So if you buy your preferred stock for $1 per share, and we're going to talk about how to get that and how to calculate that shortly, but if you acquire your preferred stock for $1 per share, that's the purchase price. And sometimes the jargon you'll see attached to that in the certificate of incorporation or elsewhere is the original issue price, or the OIP. Same thing, original issue price, purchase price, $1. The liquidation preference is a multiple of that, and it's almost always 1x. So the liquidation preference is 1 times $1. It's $1. It's never less. At least I've never seen it in decades of doing this. I've never seen a liquidation preference that's less than 1x. You will occasionally see it be greater than 1x. Maybe it's 1.2x, maybe it's 2x, maybe it's 3x. I would note that when we do see that, that's a signal of something different, something that's deviating from the norm. Maybe it's okay, maybe it's appropriate in the particular context of that deal, of that company, of that transaction, or maybe it's not, and maybe it's something that we need to sort through and negotiate out. But 99 times out of 100, 1x. So the liquidation preference is 1 times the original issue price, or $1. Okay, so this is the first piece of jargon. How does this matter? Where does it come into play? Well, it comes into play with respect to this type of preferred share that we're selling, and there are two main types. There is participating preferred and there is non-participating preferred. Okay. How do we tell the two apart? What's the difference between participating preferred and non-participating preferred? Well, the tell is the conjunction. Participating is signified by and. Non-participating is signified by or. What's this mean? Let's start with non-participating. Non-participating preferred will say, in the event of the liquidation of the company, each holder of non-participating preferred will get the greater of what? Their liquidation preference, or their pro rata share of net proceeds. Based on what? Based on the cap table. And if we're dealing in a situation where it's a 1x liquidation preference, it's their money back. It's the purchase price. So they'll get the greater of their liquidation preference or their money back, in our example, $1 a share, or they'll take their pro rata share of the net proceeds. Maybe they own 1% of the company, 0.25% of the company, 30% of the company, whatever it is. You look at the cap table, you move over to ownership percentages, you slam those against the net proceeds in the moment of liquidation, and you see what the results look like. And if it's a situation where it's a good liquidation, and maybe they would stand to take home $10 a share, well, that's great. They're going to play just like the common stockholders do. They're going to take their $10 a share. They're pro rata. Okay? The common stockholders maybe represented 70%. The preferred stockholders represented 30%. That 30% and that 70% shows up as $10 a share. They're going to take their $10 a share. But if it's going to be a dime, no thanks. That's a bad liquidation. That's the going out of business sale. They'll say, nah, give us our money back, or at least as much of it as you can. And by the way, in that case, they get to go ahead of common. So how might that look? I think it's helpful to run through an example. So let's say we have a cap table, which looks like this. We're going to have founder A, founder B, founder C, and our preferred stockholder, which we'll just give them a D. So let's give ourselves some columns. And we know that the last column is ownership percentage, and we know that it must add up to 100%. Well, what are these other categories? Well, we have common shares, and we know we have preferred shares. And then we're going to have a column where we roll these up. Oftentimes we'll call them common stock equivalents, or CSEs. It's just the addition of these two columns so that we have an even and a normalized category and column of shares to work from. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that founder A has 50 shares. Founder B has 25 shares. Founder C has 25 shares. And let's say that our preferred stockholder, we know they don't have anything. This is a common shareholder column. Our total common shares is 100. Now we're looking at preferred shares. our founders, unless they've invested, probably don't have preferred shares. None, none, none. And let's give our preferred stockholder 50 shares. Total is 50. Now, what are the common stock equivalents? Let's roll it up. 50, 25, 25, 50 for 150. Okay? What are the ownership percentages? 1/3, 1/6, 1/6, 1/3. Okay? That's how it nets out. So, or more specifically, 33%, 16%, 16%, 33%. Okay? And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that our preferred stockholder invested $2 million. That's how they got their 50 shares. They spent $2 million to get 50 shares, and we'll talk about that shortly. Well, how would this work out in a liquidation scenario? Well, we know that their total liquidation preference, 1x, is going to equal $2 million. We also know that they own 33% of the company. So, if they stand to get net proceeds, simply by taking 1/3 of what's available, if it will be higher than 2 million, that's what they'll take. So if we have net proceeds that are a total of 12 million, 1/3 of 12 million is 4 million. They get that. While holding 33% of the total equity, 4 million is more than 2 million. So the liquidation preference drops off, and they just play side by side with the common shares. Total alignment, one-to-one basis, everybody on the same page. Well, what if the total net proceeds available for distribution is $4 million? Okay? So we had gross proceeds, less liabilities, net proceeds available for distribution are $4 million. Well, what is 1/3 of $4 million? Well, I can tell you off the top, it's less than 2 million, because 2 million would represent 50%. So in this case, they don't want 1/3 of 4 million, they want their money back. So how's that going to work? Well, what you'll do is, you take the $4 million in net proceeds, and we'll say our preferred stockholder gets their 2 million, which now reduces the 4 million to 2 million. Now our preferred stockholder is now off the board. This was their opportunity to play. And the balance, the $2 million, will be allocated among the remaining common stockholders. Half will go to founder A, half will go to founders B and C. So founder A will get $1 million, 500,000, 500,000. Now you'll notice founder A probably thought they were going to get a bigger check. They saw $4 million in net proceeds, and they thought they were going to get 1/3 of that. Nope. Instead, they're getting 50% of 2 million. That's less. That's what happens. That's the power of non-participating preferred in a downside scenario, where the amount available to them under the basic pro ratas is less than what they get through the application of the liquidation preference. That's why an investor would negotiate for non-participating preferred. That's why they would say, look, we want to have this protection in a bad outcome. And the argument they make is this. In a good outcome, we agree. We should participate side by side with the common stockholders. We threw in the money, you threw in your time, this thing really worked, the chemistry was powerful, we ended up with a great outcome, everyone's happy, everybody should play side by side. In a downside scenario, the argument is, we did our part, we threw in the money, but for whatever reason, the time and effort and brain power that you put into this didn't result in the outcome that we had hoped for. And as a consequence, we're not mad at you, at least they shouldn't be, sometimes they are, but we're not mad at you, but we should have the chance to get our money back. Because it's just fair that we should get to go first before you do under this kind of negative outcome. Now, founders certainly can argue as to whether or not that's fair. But that's the basic argument, and that's the basic principle, and it holds. And it's generally perceived to be within the overall equation of the startup economy, a fair balance of pros and cons, and an appropriate economic calculus that would sort itself out between the founders on the one hand and your investors on the other hand. And that's how non-participating preferred works. Its power arises only in downside, only in a bad outcome. In a good outcome, side by side, same thing. So what does that mean with participating preferred? Well, participating preferred, there's no decision to make. With participating preferred, they always get both. So our equation actually looks a little bit different. Remember how we had, let me use a different marker. We had assets minus liabilities equals equity. Well, what happens all the time with participating preferred is that we add in this other component here of the liquidation preference. So our example, let's say that our assets minus liabilities, our net proceeds are $10 million. Now we pay off the liquidation preference. Let's just use our example over there. $2 million. That leaves $8 million in net proceeds, and they're going to get their 33% of that. So they get their money back here before anybody else gets anything, and they're going to get their pro rata share of whatever's left. Now, founders may call that 2 bites at the apple or double dipping. Investors might call that an appropriate allocation of risk within the context of a highly speculative early stage company. A lot of words, they need better branding because it doesn't have the same toothiness that double dipping has. But the bottom line is participating preferred exists. You see it. It shows up in a lot of transactions. It's definitely the minority position. Non-participating preferred certainly is the majority position. There are many people who feel very strongly about participating preferred, almost to the point of having a theologically or a philosophically antagonistic position to it. Very understandable, particularly if you're on the founder side. The argument goes there's no alignment. Non-participating preferred gives you alignment for upside. You're working on the same page. You don't have the same level of alignment here because they get paid and get paid extra every time. Good liquidation or bad liquidation. What I would contend and what I would suggest as a basic takeaway is it's not an issue of good or bad or good or evil or right or wrong. It's a question of economics. And there are lots of economics that go into these transactions, and the most important one we're getting ready to talk about, which is valuation, which talks to how do we even get to this 33% number. Some investors believe they need this extra juice in order to make the outcome work for them. And if you as a founder are comfortable with all the other terms of the transaction, you're comfortable with the valuation, which is going to talk about ownership percentages, you're comfortable with the board composition, you're comfortable with the protective provisions, you're comfortable with any other rights or privileges or benefits that the preferred investors are looking for, you like the preferred investors, you get along, there's a good vibe, they can be strategic and helpful. In that case, if you can wrap your head around it, maybe you're fine conceding the point on giving them participating preferred. Or maybe you're not, and you've got to negotiate that away and make a decision. But it's just an economic point. That's it, okay? There's no morality here, it's just an economic point. But that's the fundamental difference between participating preferred and non-participating preferred. So to break it down, common shares for services, preferred shares for money. Preferred shares have two advantages that common shares do not. They have some extra rights when it comes to control and governance. Those extra rights show up at the level of the stockholders, where they have protective provisions, these veto rights. They also show up frequently as the request for and the granting of a board seat. So they're sitting in the boardroom and they're acting as a director. That's the control and governance piece. On the economic side, it shows up with the character of the preferred security. And it's going to be non-participating preferred or participating preferred. Non-participating preferred, that's going to give them downside protection. Upside, just like common.